Yeah, thanks. Sounds great, Molly. And thanks so much for your facilitation. And thanks to all of you for showing up today. We're really excited to, talk about this kind of unwieldy topic, especially as Helen says, since we were so excited we just got funding to work together on this, Helen and Imtiaz Ringwala and Brian Miller and I. So what I want to do, and let me introduce myself, I guess. I'm Shelley Crausbay. I'm a consortium partner for the North Central Climate Adaptation Science Center, and I am a senior scientist at Conservation Science Partners. And I'll let Brian introduce himself. He's gonna tag out with me halfway through this talk. So what I wanted to do was just kind of get started with our thinking on why we need ecological scenarios. And I just wanted to start with some sort of, common newspaper kind of articles that I'm sure many of us run into and get sucked into, such as this one, like, is this the end of forests as we know them? Things like Mojave Desert fire really ruining Joshua Tree forest habitat, and heat dome killing tons of marine animals. All of these things are really pointing to this idea that climate change can cause ecological transformation. And I just wanted to define that here so we all have clarity in what we're talking about. And what this is for us is the dramatic and really irreversible, on timescales that matter to us, right, shift in multiple ecological characteristics of an ecosystem. But the real basis and the real root of that is a high degree of turnover in ecological communities. So species turnover, so that's one species being replaced by another species in any one place. And this is happening, because of those articles that we all run into more frequently nowadays, because individual species are being challenged by climate trends and the climate extremes that they're experiencing in any one place. Now, this has happened in the past. This is not a new, phenomenon under the sun. Ecological transformation has been really pervasive in the paleorecord. So I wanted to show this paper that came out recently that looks at, first of all, composition, so that, species composition on the left, and you can see it's kind of comparing how different is composition from the last glacial maximum when we were in a totally different climate, around 18-ish thousand years ago to today. And you can see that there are large compositional changes across the globe, and the same with structure. So these kind of changes, ecological transformation, are really common when climate change is rapid and strong as it was at this time. And so you can take that as sort of baseline data and try and project into the future what the risk of ecological, or the threat of future ecological transformation might be. And you can see that the probability of large change is really very high across most of the globe. And in fact, we're already seeing this. So this paper came out recently in Science that's trying to map the recent turnover rates in ecological communities. So anywhere where there's colored area here, we have data and information that tells us that species are already being replaced by different kinds of species. And so there's a median of 28% that's already been replaced. So this is happening. And it's really asking our conservation strategies to kind of rethink themselves in a sense. And that's putting pressure on scientists as well. We need to try and get a better handle on what ecological transformation might look like. And so, for example, frameworks like the RAD framework, the Resist, Accept, Direct framework, which Brian will talk about a little bit later, are really asking us to ask different questions. And especially, what will ecological transformation look like? In the RAD framework, what does acceptance look like? And actually, that's a really super challenging question to answer. And the reason for this is because there's a huge diversity of ecological processes at play here as species replace each other. There's competition, facilitation, all kinds of demographic processes going on. There's also real novelty that we have today on our landscapes, both in terms of biota and non-native species, but also in terms of the kinds of climate changes and even our land use that we experience on the landscape. But the biggest thing are these environmental contingencies. There's so much stochasticity in weather and climate events, whether you have a drought followed by a pluvial. There's stochasticity in demographic events when species disperse their seeds, for example. And also these historical legacies are super important, whether that's a management history or whether it's even sort of a founder effect of which species showed up after a disturbance event happened. So these things are really complicated, and it makes it very difficult to predict with any certainty, what might happen in the future. And I just want to show a quick example of this from the paleorecord. So this graph is showing some ecological transformations that happened when climate change was changing really rapidly around 21,000 to 7,500 years ago. This is all from the Middle Rockies and Southern Rockies. And what you can see is that no matter what vegetation type you have on the left side, it transformed into multiple different kinds of vegetation types on the right side. And if we just look closely at the sagebrush example, quite a lot of the landscape in the Southern and Middle Rockies was covered with sagebrush at this time. And the way these sites left sagebrush and went into new communities, actually forested communities, was really unique and different across sites. So this graph is showing you sort of an ordination. We're looking at species space, and we're looking at how a site traveled and what was its pathway to change from a sagebrush site. They all started in pretty similar places, but their pathways were really different and their endpoints were really different after a certain amount of time. So this kind of made us sit around and think, wow, it's really hard to predict these future ecological endpoints and trajectories. And in fact, we think they're pretty uncertain, much like climate change is. And so with that, I want to turn it over to Brian Miller, because I think he can give us some great insight into what we can do with uncertainty. Brian?
Thanks, Shelley. So yeah, for those of you that I don't know, I'm Brian Miller. I'm an ecologist with the U.S. Geological Survey and full-time at the North Central Climate Adaptation Science Center. So yeah, good to be with you all, and thanks for listening and being part of the session, and also putting up with us talking at you for a little bit. We'll get more into engagement with you guys here shortly. But before we did that, I wanted to make sure that we touched a little bit on scenario planning. And if you're in the session that MTI was organized and led this morning, apologies if there's some redundancy here, but I thought some of this is useful for folks that aren't familiar with scenario planning. So anyway, if you were in that session, you'll have seen that I've used this Gary Larson cartoon to depict the feeling that you may have at this point in the presentation, where you're sort of like, gosh, there's so much uncertainty. Around climate change, around ecological responses. How can we possibly, make an informed decision that will lead us to a successful outcome? I guess I'm here to say that we don't have to feel that way. There are tools that we have at our disposal to make informed decisions that account for uncertainty. They don't ignore it, take it into account, so that we can set ourselves up for success. And that's what scenario planning is designed to do. And as Shelley put it the other day when we were talking, she said, we eat uncertainty for breakfast. So let's all take on that attitude here as we get into it. Just to touch on scenario planning and what it is. So we can go to the next slide, please. So in a nutshell, it's a framework that looks for or builds plans around a broad range of plausible future conditions. And this stands in stark contrast to a forecast-based approach, which is one that we might be more familiar with. It's there on the lower left. And with a forecast-based approach, you sort of say, okay, here's this one future that we think will transpire, and let's plan for that one single outcome. A scenario-based approach instead says, look, we don't have a crystal ball, and we might face some very different future conditions depicted by those dashed arrows there. And so in order to be successful and develop plans that are robust to that uncertainty, let's consider a small set of them that captures the broadest plausible range of future conditions. And so that's the approach that we take with scenario planning. And it's highly appropriate for something like climate change. In this process, yeah, go ahead, that's fine. Head on to the next slide there. is it really begins with the resources in question, a particular park unit or management unit or management area or species. And we use information about the cultural and natural resources or infrastructure in that place to identify aspects of climate that are relevant to that system. What are the aspects of climate that that system is sensitive to? And can we identify small set, 2, 3, 4, what we call climate futures that capture the broadest range in those conditions that we might face in the future. So a climate future is a summary of relevant climate information. And we pull this from global climate model projections, and we use it to develop our scenarios. Climate futures are the climate information. Go ahead and go to the next slide. And often we sort of pick these by using this sort of bivariate scatter plot type of an approach. This is just one sort of bit of a cartoon example to show the distribution of global climate model projections for annual average temperature and precipitation. We might look at a different set of variables that are relevant, like spring precipitation or freeze-thaw events or what have you. But this illustrates the point that we'd want to pick 2 to 4 climate model projections that span the broadest possible range of conditions we might face. And here we've selected a warm, wet, and a hot, dry future. Go ahead and go to the next slide. And we might summarize that information. We use that then together with participants and subject matter experts to turn this climate information into actual scenarios, descriptions of how these conditions could affect resources. And those are our climate resource scenarios. Go ahead and go to the next slide. In those scenarios, those storylines about how climate change might impact resources are then used to inform decision-making and develop plans that are robust to the uncertainties we could face. Let's go ahead and go to the next slide. Now, typically, when we do this, we sort of have this one-to-one relationship between the global climate model projections that we're showing here and our climate resource scenarios. So for a warm, wet climate future, you might say, okay, well, here's the impacts we might see, and same for hot, dry. But we want to recognize, I think, particularly given what Shelley just told us, is that there's plenty of uncertainty in ecological response as well that we should recognize and accommodate in our planning efforts. Go ahead and go to the next slide. So to show you what I mean, here's a figure that Shelley and colleagues came up with for a recent article in Bioscience to illustrate that for here, let's say we're looking just at our warm, wet climate future. You could imagine there might be multiple different ecological outcomes. And this could be for a whole variety of reasons relating to species distributions and community assembly dynamics, historical contingencies, you name it, a whole variety of ecological processes that could influence which pathway you might go down even for one particular location or area. Let's go to the next slide. Similarly, for that hot, dry climate future, you could imagine another set of ecological outcomes. And perhaps this gets even more nuanced when you throw in things like invasive species that could perhaps lead to quite a lot of ecological difference than what you've seen historically. Go to the next slide. And so all of this, sort of these ideas around recognizing and accommodating potential uncertainties and ecological outcomes, I think comes at a time that is really prescient because you've probably seen or heard about this resist, accept, direct, or RAD as it's called for short, framework. And I think it's already creating demand for information about future ecological responses to climate change. Managers are now being asked to consider these resist, accept, and direct strategies. And that's kind of captured here with this really nice figure from the climate change response program showing the sailboat, right? And you can think of this analogy whereby the sailboat's trying to get across this body of water, perhaps toward the mountains, but there's this fierce headwind. And a resist strategy might be to say, let's pull the sails down. We're going to turn on the gas engines and see if we can, blast our way across the lake into that headwind. An accept strategy might be to say, well, let's just pull down the sails, turn off the engines, and see where the wind takes us. Or a direct strategy might be to say, well, we can't really realistically make it across this lake. That's our first choice, but how about we redirect to a different but still favorable outcome of going to this nice sandy beach over there. And this just gives you a sense of the types of intentional decisions that managers are now being asked to make in the face of climate change with their resource management. And so we have to, I think, as scientists, practitioners, managers as well, start to develop a better understanding of what are we accepting exactly. If we say we're going to accept ecological change, what does that look like? What are our options? What are our options for directing change? Recognizing all of the contingencies and uncertainties around ecological transformation that Shelley laid out. So hopefully this gives us some motivation to say, hey, the time is now. We got to be ready to be able to unpack and understand and use these ecological scenarios.